as I was mentioning, there are, based on the conversations that we've had this morning and the results from the Project Developers Forum benchmarking survey, there are a multitude of views about the role of DFIs as it relates to early stage financing, the provision of grants, the role that development partners can play in this particular process. And we really want to use this panel and this opportunity to bring some key stakeholders together to share their alternative views, one, two, to really begin to look at the types of innovations that are possible, and then not just sort of walk away identifying that, these are the challenges, but see who can individually or collectively provide the leadership that the industry really needs. I think we all understand that we can, in our own individual facilities, capacities, bring projects to a certain point, but getting it over the line, I was saying to Lyda earlier, that some of the conversations we're having now about working with governments or building the project development practitioners community from the private sector standpoint, these conversations have been going on for quite some time. So what we really want to be able to do is, how can we collate a lot of that knowledge and really seek to lay down some foundational steps about how the community can perhaps take a more lateral as opposed to vertical view on driving some of these projects to financial close, which is the theme that we have today. So in this respect, I'm joined by a number of experts and panelists. So we have Lyda Fitz, who is the Regional Director for Sub-Saharan Africa at the US Trade and Development Agency. I know you're all hungry, but perhaps a little round of applause for Lyda. Just to warm her up might work well. And please don't make Bertrand feel isolated by not giving him a round of applause. So I have Bertrand Belbin, senior, yes, clap for ourselves. The road to lunch. Yes, so Bertrand is the Senior Business Development Manager at Infraco with an additional special responsibility for East Africa. Then I have Chinua Azubuike, who is the CEO of InfraCredit. No round of applause, and I think that you'll be very pleased and interested to hear what Chinua has to say, because I think one of his major shareholders is here today, and we keep talking about this whole topic of the ability or the level of interest for institutional capital on the one hand, but then African institutional capital on the other, to be able to deploy and allocate to project development and infrastructure in Africa. And I think Chinua's got a unique story to say in that respect. And last but not least, we have Emmanuel Matz, who is the Head of Strategy, Energy and Infrastructure at Propaco. So the essence of the focus of this session is really going to be to get, hopefully, the speakers to provide candid and constructive insights and proposals and recommendations to forward-looking opportunities. I think it's very clear today that we've taken stock in many respects of some of the challenges. I think what we really want to do is be able to draw on the panelists' expertise in terms of what are some of the things that can potentially be done different, taking stock of the lessons learned in terms of where we are, and lessons learned in the context of good opportunities and strategies to crowd in early stage capital and commercial capital and institutional capital into project development. And this sort of missing issue of how can we accelerate financial close, drawing on our own experiences, and any ideas around how the DFI and development partner community could potentially accelerate their response times in terms of their participation, if necessary at all. I think we'll have a conversation about that. And I think to get us going, I'd just like to extend this question to all of our panels, just to give some opening sort of scene-setting comments, and perhaps we'll start with you, Lyda, in that respect, give your broad view, and then we'll break into a conversation.
Thanks, Stuart. It's always great to be here. You get a good discussion going. So just briefly, I'm Lyda Fitz. I am from U.S. Trade and Development Agency, which is the U.S. government's project preparation agency. And we have been around about 25 years, and we have put in about $1 billion globally into project preparation. And out of our globally, we currently have investments in about 250 projects. 100 of those are in Africa. And of that 100, about 75% of them are in power, just a sense of where we've put money. And Africa is our largest portfolio and growing more with year by year. So that is really partially in response to demand both from a sense that project preparation was very much needed in this market, and a response for the increased amount of interest from investors, from project developers, both locally and internationally. For the past couple of years, we have received 550 proposals just in power in Africa, so there's a lot going on. We recently did a study with the DBSA, a partner of ours, and the Sustainable Infrastructure Development Program under WEF about project preparation, and identified that in 2017, this is out of 136 facilities, which I should note about 40% of them actually responded, so about 50. There were in Africa $800 million available in 2017 for project preparation, and about $1.57 billion available in guarantees. So there's a significant amount of funding out there for project preparation. And most of those facilities were supporting the private sector or PPPs, not exclusively the governments. And that, I was very interested in the benchmarking study that we talked about this morning, of the identification from both the private developer side and the infrastructure, the investor side, that policy risk, the change of government policy, political risk was the number one issue facing the number one risk to projects moving forward. And that's certainly our experience. We recently looked over our current investments to say, okay, of the projects that we've put money into, this 100 or so that are currently active, which ones are experiencing delays and why? And by far, the number one reason, dwarfing second and third and fourth, was lack of clarity or lack of clear commitment on the government side to moving forward. So it wasn't not being able to meet government requirements. It wasn't not being able to find financing. It was lack of clarity from the government side. And when you look at the markets that have attracted, where we see the most demand for us and that have attracted the most money, you see clearly that they have provided that clarity. And Kenya put out, what it was going to require in terms of PPAs and a clear tariff rate, an enormous amount of private sector developers and financing came into that market. So much so that they brought on too much. Now they have more demand than they can respond to in terms of prospective projects that have resources to move forward. Similarly in Ghana, there was a clarity enough in the market, and now they've signed more PPAs than they can honor. So they had an enormous response rate in terms of funds coming in, but then so much so that they're not able to manage that. And I think South Africa obviously ran one of the best. The REIPP program is really the best market clarity instrument, perhaps globally, but certainly on the continent. And the initial dividends from that weren't just the lower tariffs, but like bringing in industry. There are all of these folks coming in to develop solar plants in South Africa. That's the kind of response that any government would want to see. But as all three of these markets are like case studies and people who have done things well, they also are now have recently had a fair amount of uncertainty. So we're really looking at both for our own success rate, because we don't want our 25 years of what our average success rate to go down based on our African investments, but across the board, we're looking at how can we better engage governments to make sure that we are bringing as much leverage for our partners in creating that clarity and movement as possible.
Thanks, Lida. Can I just stay with you for a second? In terms of this reviewing of the leverage that you can bring to positively unlock these opportunities, both your own portfolio, the government's development dividend, and the developers' return profile. Can you just give us a couple of examples of what you're doing differently in that, or how you view that?
So over the past 4 or 5 years, we went from largely working with governments to working almost exclusively with private developers. And initially, we didn't change our we just, looked at their plan, looked how it matched up with the government's plan, and did our general assessment. But now we are realizing that from the get-go, we need to make sure that we're linking in with the government, that they understand that we are putting in money based on what they're currently saying, and that we expect that those rules of the game to stay static throughout. And since we are part of the U.S. government, we do have some leverage to bring once we have made that commitment to try and meet and communicate as frequently as possible with the government throughout, so that we can maintain that. That's something that we can bring as having a government portion. I think that, and we can also band with, we co-support something with DVSA, with NEPAD, but even when we're working with private project preparation facilities, where can we come together to add additional leverage on that side? I think that one of the things I often hear about in project finance is financiers coming together to make sure it's not so much that one entity couldn't put in more money, but you want to make sure that you've got as much leverage within that band as possible, and that's even important at the preparation stage, because there is just so much dynamism in the market.
Thanks, Lida. Bertrand, the same sort of perspective to you, but I'm very interested to hear how your conglomerate of institutions within the sort of the British DFI world and DFID are supporting some of your work, and do you have a different view today and a different approach in respect to leverage that you probably would have had as an institution 3 or 5 years ago?
Thanks for that, Hubert. I will answer the question, but I quite like how you introduced the people here, the sort of innovative aspects that we have to bring in order to catalyze private sector investment in infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa. We think we're an innovative tool to a certain degree, and without any pretensions, don't get me wrong. Who would put $30 million to dig holes in Ethiopia in geothermal in Korbeti? Who would go and develop a 30 megawatt solar plant in Chad with Aldwych? Who would go and develop a 40 megawatt plant in Guinea-Conakry with Aldwych? So Infraco does that. Infraco is part of a group, and I'll come back to your leverage question when I talk about the group. But basically, we think we're quite innovative in the sense that I heard this morning, smart money is early money. We are that. So we're here to alleviate poverty in sub-Saharan Africa by catalyzing private sector investment in sub-Saharan Africa in infrastructure projects. And I believe there's only a handful of us. We are not big numbers, we are not big tickets, but we are pure risk. Because the project may never happen. When we put our 5 million in developing such or such project, it may take 20 years. The thing is, we'll hang on there. That's our core mission. And in addition to that, we scratch our head a bit. And for instance, we are now embarking into, and this is where I will leverage on the group we belong to, which is the PIDS, the Private Infrastructure Development Group, same mission as us, but different instruments. So for example, we've got EAIF, Emerging African Infrastructure Fund, who provides senior debt. We've got Garanco, who are all about promoting local currency. And to that degree, and with them, we're currently working on a sub-10 megawatt local currency PPA in Kenya for a solar plant. So we're happy to take the early stage risk on that. We know we're going to be pioneering. The idea is to catalyze local currency private money to come into this project and hopefully open doors to many more coming, basically. And that's fun. That's also difficult because, as we've heard this morning, there's lots of money. Projects have their difficulties. Government are, I hope there's no officials in the room, are a bit painful at times. Let me put it this way. And we are there to bear that risk, but it's not an easy task. Other thing we bring, I think, which is a little bit outside of the box, or at least our box, is working with renowned developers such as Aldwych, for example, or Berkeley Energy in Corbett in geothermal. And we have our own internal expertise. So when, a bit like Lyda, when she gets application for a grant, we get lots of applications, and the guys are nowhere near any entertainable project at the time they come to us. And especially these days with solar, where every man and his dog thinks he can do solar. That's not true. We're not necessarily after big balance sheet, but we're after sound project fundamentals, and that's critical to us. And this is how we select the projects we get into. And I've lost my train of thoughts now. What was I saying? Let's see the crowd listening. Please help me there.
I'm sure everyone was listening, but you were making some interesting points on the fundamentals and your selection criteria.
I've got it back. Expertise, I was saying, that's what we sort of bring. So through partners we work with, but also internally. We all come from the private project development side of the story. Some of us have seen it all the way to financial close and even through construction. And when we get poor application, we don't reject, we guide. We tell them, we suggest you do this, this and that, and then come back and talk to us. We are not there to be selective, we are there to alleviate poverty in Africa. We all know the need is there, 621 million people without electricity just in the power space. So we want to help by as much as we can. We either do that directly or through our renowned developers we're working with.
If I could ask you honestly, which lens do you typically use to assess your proposals? Because we have many friends and colleagues in the industry who come from the development finance world and then become project developers themselves and realize how difficult it is and how terms are slightly not going in their favor on the other side of the fence. I mean, is there a way that we need to look at how we view the private sector? I mean, we heard today that perhaps there's a little bit of a misalignment of objectives, or not, as the case may be.
Dare I say not? I think that's why we're here. We need to promote ourselves. I'm sure we are very bad at it because we are just project guys. We're not marketing people, and that's definitely something we're working on. But we're not limited by money. If we find good projects, they'll get money. And therefore, to find good projects, like I was saying, we need thousands. And out of the 1,000, if we get 5, we're having a good year. I'm exaggerating, don't quote me on the numbers, but the length we put is quite, on analyzing and filtering the project, is quite, how can I put it, narrow, because as I said, not many projects have all the fundamentals, And when we go to chat, if the fundamentals are there, and that's the other aspect I wanted to elaborate on through the expertise we bring through our group pitch, is we will enable the environment that will attract private sector. We will make it investor friendly. And we have capacitation money within the pitch group ready to do that alongside the core project development.
Do you have development friendly money? If you're helping to build the capacity
every
on the development side.
No, every developer, because that's their game, will tell you we are not developer friendly. They want the biggest share of the cake at the minimum risk. And that's what. But this is not a bad thing. This is a healthy negotiation to make a deal happen.
I'm really talking more from the development of the project developer industry.
Yeah, that's what
so that your pipeline, the more rise up and be competitive and meet your standards and criteria over time. Same sort of approach we saw in the venture capital industry, where there was support to help the funds develop. Is there more that can be done potentially to help build the project developer professionalism and industry, or is that not necessarily a priority for future pipeline?
Infraco's mandate is not about that. It's about developing projects and not developing developers, if that's your question. However, to develop projects, you need developed developers or being developed developers, and to that degree we contribute as well. But as I said, how do you develop a developer? I think is by making a project successful with the already developed developers, the renowned ones. I'm not going to name them again, Aldwych being one. And basically these guys, set the tone, sets the PPAs, and lead to a form of standardization to follow on. It never happens overnight. You probably need 5 or 10 iterations, depending on the country, the projects, and what have you. But the idea is we fund these guys to build the tracks, so other less developed developers can come behind. But our mandate, our real mandate project is not about developing developers. I want to say 2 things though, because I guess my time is getting... in terms of facilitating, there's a good website called Infrastructure Consortium for Africa, which lists, there's a fund finder there, which lists what money is available for what project at what stage, and it's quite good. It's pretty generic. I'm sure all the attendants here knows about that stuff. But for the man and a dog who wants to do solar in Central Republic of Africa, that stuff is welcome. The other thing is AFIDA, the Association for Infrastructure Developers in Africa. I think is another good channel, not only because it pushes networking of developers together, but also because it's about advocacy, going to see governments as a group of developers and kind of flexing muscles so we get heard as developers. But it's also about standardizing documentations as much as possible. I think it's a bit of wishful thinking, if you ask me, really. But an effort towards that will help reduce development costs and therefore make project happen, essentially.
Thank you, Bertrand. So this notion that there's no institutional investor appetite for early stage commercial project development on the continent, true or false, Gino?
Thank you, Hubert. Maybe I'll start with the context, give a background. I work for the CEO of InfraCredit. InfraCredit is a specialized infrastructure financial guarantor established by the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority in collaboration with Garanco. We're set up to provide guarantees to facilitate long-term local currency financing for infrastructure, crowding in local pension funds and insurance companies in Nigeria. Like to the point that's been said, it's a development cycle from early stage to. Our role is to help connect local currency financing to those long-term investors that have the appetite, and with our guarantees, being a local currency AAA rated domestic guarantor, within the first year of operations, so we started last year, and our first transaction was we backed the bond issue by a power developer, and I was able to issue a 10-year local currency bond, crowded in 16 institutional investors and 12 pension funds, and it was oversubscribed. Prior to that, we haven't had a corporate infrastructure bond of 10 years being issued in Nigeria. And to give a context, in Nigeria we have one of the fastest growing pension funds. Our pension funds is size about equivalent to about $22 billion, growing at an annual rate of 15% per annum. They can invest up to 35% in corporate bonds and infrastructure bonds, and I think up to 5% in infrastructure funds, and they have less than 0.5% in that asset class. But what we've been able to demonstrate is that with innovative credit enhancement tools, you can allocate long-term currency financing from domestic investors into infrastructure, and in terms of what we see as a long-term challenge, which is to this panel, and which makes it interesting for us, is a logical extension of an InfraCredit is on the early stage financing. What type of structure currently exists in the market? Because today we have a pipeline of transactions we're looking at, which are operating assets with predictable cash flows, because we back post-financial close. However, the investors want to see more deals. There are few operating assets, and it means that you have to look at the factory, basically the developers who are creating these assets, and how many pipelines are available that can be potentially refinanced and move to long-term investors like the pension funds. And so we're talking to developers, or developers are talking to us, because for the developers, I think before our existence, there was a lack of access to post-financial close financing, in long-term financing, because local banks don't lend long-term, in Nigeria particularly, because of financial constraints in terms of regulation, Basel III. And so being able to demonstrate that the case study of the transaction we backed was financed by a private equity fund. They developed the projects, and then once it got to commercial operations, they were able to raise long-term financing. So it provides a template for developers working in concert with governments to develop the right type of projects that can access long-term local currency financing. So is there appetite? There is appetite for early stage. However, I think talking to the pension funds and the engagement we've had, there's an interest in seeing how they can support directly or indirectly. Again, their regulation restricts direct investment. They could go through funds, but we also are developing our tools, and so we've also discussed the prospects of providing contingent refinancing guarantees that would act as a catalyst and an incentive for early stage investors to develop the right type of projects with an assurance that post-commercial operations, you can recycle capital by InfraCredit providing a guarantee for takeout financing. So
can I just ask, so just interrupt there, how's that being received by the market?
There's a lot of interest. I think based on discussions we've had, and I think quite one or two developers in this room we have met with, and others we will be meeting with, and it's purely towards trying to understand how to integrate the product to their projects. And it's something we're very keen on trying to integrate, because the value chain has to be aligned. We have to have a organized model where developers are developing the right type of projects that the secondary investors have appetite for, that governments also understand that they have a commitment to ensure that they support projects to get to financial close, because there is a capital market that would finance these assets. I think to the extent that we can align both secondary and primary investors through whatever platforms or co-investment vehicles that could be developed, would help de-risk what we currently find as a risky phase of the cycle. And so there is appetite. The structure is something that needs to be discussed and formulated. We find that probably there needs to be a bit more coordination in terms of between the current preparatory facilities that exist and how they operate in local markets. An InfraCredit example demonstrates, I think, again, a case study for how you can work with local institutions with boots on the ground that are able to do the selection, conduct the selection, conduct the due diligence, conduct the coordination locally, and act as more or less as your local partner. So models like this could be replicated across the value chain. So looking at how do you replicate the success of a secondary credit mitigant facility like InfraCredit into the primary phase of the market, and what sort of structures can exist to help catalyze and connect the entire value chain. So that's, for us, it's a theoretical question, but I think practically we can achieve it. I think the success of our sponsors in setting us up within the last 2 years, and the fact that today we are getting positive reverse inquiry from pension funds asking for our deal pipeline, because they want to plan their investments across what InfraCredit will be wrapping in the next few months, demonstrates that there is appetite for well-structured, enhanced products, and therefore there has to be a well-structured way of developing these assets. And it's something that we think an aligned incentive across the value chain, and also probably, and I've read some of the reports prepared, which suggest the idea of either some form of co-investment platform or project development facility that coordinates government, developers, and institutional investors. I think it's possible, certainly possible. It's really about being able to run a pilot, develop a platform. We've already seen structures on ground that are being discussed. And I think if all things being equal, we should be able to work towards showing a case study at some point that can be replicated.
I think NEPAD's done some exceptional work in that area, particularly on the 5% agenda, where the co-investment platform will seem to be a very integral piece to be able to intermediate all the key stakeholders, recognizing that ultimately, you've got to be able to find an exit for the institutional investors, and to get them in at a very early stage and help them understand the risk is a pretty key piece. And I know Emmanuel, who I'm going to come to now, I mean, when we spoke, We looked at the issue of, you provide support for governments and project developers. And I was really just, I'm keen to hear your views again on the extent to which the likes of a Propaco could support the education, the early education and the ongoing sort of capacity and technical development of pension fund trustees, investment staff, investment consultants, that ultimately the same constituency that we all talk about trying to crowd in to play a fuller role in infrastructure development on the continent.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So I don't know whether you're aware of and very familiar with Proparco, but it is the subsidiary of French Development Agency. So it's the French institution dedicated to the private sector, and we celebrated our 40th anniversary last year. So we are pretty young institutions, although our parent company is on the continent for 70 years now. Briefly said, what from essence, what we are doing in terms of pushing hard to making IPPs and new projects happening in the continent is really trying to align as much as possible the public and the private interests in a specific project. Our parent company has a dedicated impact on and a daily discussion with all the key main public actors, Ministry of Industry, Ministry of Energy, regulators, and we do have those day-to-day relationship with private companies. And how can we align to the interests, how we could work all together in order to make things happening in a specific country. This is really what we are trying to do on a daily basis, and this is what has been quite successful in Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, in Cameroon right now, in Senegal recently. And when you saw, and this morning there was a point with respect to project finance saying that it is very long option. Is it the sole one? Is it really the good one? I think that Senegal was a good example of what could be done when things are done properly. Our parent company has worked for several years with Senelec, the off-taker, to try to make the sector sustainable and to try to address the main key issues. That has helped and enabled the private sector to be comfortable in investing in the sector in the country, and that has conducted to successful 2 power plants last year, for instance, which were one of the few solar power plants implemented in a very short timeline, because we spoke all in all about 9 months, I believe, in Western Africa. So I think that alignment between and discussion between the private and the public sector is really our key role. We are doing that on a daily basis. We are developing funds and trying to attract UE funds to do so more. We have entered and secured a facility launched 2 years ago, which is called Aeroscale, according to which half of the facility is dedicated to the public funds of AFD in order for them to support the implementation and improvement of the regulation in specific countries. It is to be noticed that IPP regulatory schemes have improved a lot in all Africa, but still some countries are missing, and you commented Chad, for instance, and some others, such as Guinea, for instance. And on the other side, the other part of that fund is dedicated to Proparco to guarantee private participation we would take in equity investment we would take in off-grid companies. Because the answer for us really it's partnership, and it's not one fold. I mean, there is no the answer to power or to improved access of power to Africa continent is really not one. It's a joint effort and joint solution from public-private entities and initiatives, but it is also private to private initiatives, and we see that markets developing as well quite significantly, and this is something we are trying to push as well and to support as well, because we see that everybody is very impatient in order to see solutions scaling up quite quickly, which is a key challenge for all of us. And it's true that pure public-private solutions will not be in the position to answer that and to cope with this field.
Well, thank you for that. And this makes me think about this whole issue that we were talking about in terms of leverage. And I'm just wondering what your view is on the opportunity to include other stakeholders in that sort of ecosystem when we talk about leverage, because we've seen a number of governments or development finance institutions increasingly recognize that their own domestic institutional investors in some form or another could gain benefits from participating in infrastructure opportunities on the continent. But of course, it would take the development partner or the development finance institution, it would need to structure itself and pursue some degree of engagement and education over time. Is that something that you feel could be more widespread?
So here we're speaking more, let me take a recent intermediation example we set up at the beginning of the year with Amundi and IFC in order to try to increase and to build those market for green bonds. We entered into a Amundi green bond facility, which is structured under 3 layers. One is a first loss layer, fully provided by IFC. The second one is a junior layer, and the third one is a senior one. And this facility, amounting 1.4 billion, aims to attract financial institutions, whether locally, whether internationally, to go to emerging countries, to go to green funds, to go to climate projects, to support them through green bonds, and to try to create this new market, which needs to be created in a lot of emerging countries, not only in Africa but as well in emerging countries. So this is typically what we do. We are intervening in supporting strongly the junior tranche, and we have subscribed significantly as well in the senior to attract new local institutions and pension funds in these funds, so that with the aim of having this facility becoming 2 billion in 7 years time.
Thank you. I'd like to just get your views, Bertrand, and yours, Lydia, as well, about Chinua's model. Is that something that you would take a serious look at? Is it a type of platform that you think there's a natural fit and good role for you going forward, anticipating where the market's likely to be in sort of 5 to 7 years, and the sort of macro big objectives of crowding in this institutional money, but perhaps taking a more horizontal as opposed to vertical view of the sort of pipeline and the sort of supply issues around infrastructure?
I think the pitch philosophy is kind of that. Sorry, I'm banging about pitch, because at the end of the day, they are my employer, so I have to. But within the pitch, you have everything except the developer. So you have early stage money, the infracos, because by the way, there's Infraco Asia that exists as well, same mandate as us. Followed by EAF, Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund, and they can come towards us, I would say, as well as senior debt. They are a bit on the mezzanine side when it comes to construction. They could. There used to be GAP, Green Africa Power, no longer exists. I think EAF have taken over their mandate to a certain degree. You also have the guarantors who help basically promoting local currency, but who are also creative in terms of products they use. So I think there's an idea there to use. By the way, we're multilaterally funded. We have a couple of big governments funding us, funding pitch, and therefore funding the facilities within pitch. There's another facility, by the way, that's called grant funding, so it's TAF, Technical Assistance Facility. But I think that the point I'm trying to make is this horizontal integration where through the project cycle, in theory, within pitch, you have basically an answer to your need, depending on where you are in the project development. And we've seen this replicated, Climate Investor One, they have exactly the same story, kind of achieving the same goal, I would say, but differently set up. IFC was there ages ago, way before all of us, where you have the whole chain, IFC Infraventure, kind of take the early risk, and then you have all the IFC suite there available. And I feel we're trying to address that. Can it be addressed better by all of us? Definitely. When at the end of every year we count the number of projects done and we're like, wow, we've closed 10 projects that year and we're all clapping.
Can I stick with you on that? Definitely. Could you unpack that definitely a bit more in terms of what would you change? What would
to make it better?
To make it better.
Is the panel allowed to say, hey, the panel doesn't know?
Again?
Yeah. I don't know, what can market ourselves better, work together, it's kind of the same thing again. Advocacy, work with governments, the issue is about aligning interests, really, because we all come from different angles on all these things, and everybody is trying to pull the cover his way or her way. And that's a difficulty. And you have to have disappointment from all parties, equally shared, I would say, so projects happen. And projects will never have zero risk, otherwise there would be zero return. So we should be clear on that. And then it's how you optimize the risk distribution to make sure the project ultimately serves the Africans in terms of, well, have in mind when I say that, I mean the lowest possible tariff. And there are some success stories. I think the South African program is a success story. This morning, the Get Fit in Uganda is another one. And it's by working all together and not competing between DFIs that will make it work. That's my conviction. Maybe my grandchildren will see the color of that.
Let's hear Laida's views. And again, if you could just also touch on this point of the extent to which you can crowd in longer-term institutional money. You've heard a pension fund from Uganda, Richard here, who heads one of the funds here, saying, how can I participate? Is there a way that if you're intermediating and in some cases articulating the frameworks out there for key sort of constituents, is there a way that you can perhaps help the African Pension Fund community get access to some of the opportunities that you have?
So I would say, first of all, what I think is most exciting about the model, from my perspective, is how it is catalyzing local financing. That ability to have local currency, but also local risk perception, which is also often very different from international risk perception, I think is a real opener to a lot of project movement that might otherwise be slowed or not move at all. So that's been something that we have benefited from in terms of projects that have then gone into financing from regional development banks or local development banks, but also the success, I think, across the board on project bond issuances in Africa demonstrates the appetite of local investors and investors generally into the market, specifically when it's not project specific. So that I think is exciting. And the close, we are very early on. So usually we're really not intersecting with a pension fund, who often don't even want to touch greenfield, much less not even yet to the field, we're just trying to design the project. But knowing that there are, we do track and support our projects, up to and past financial close. So being able to connect to more and more of these institutions to say, here's our portfolio, here's what we've already vetted and stamped, if we could use some of that sort of, if you could take some of the credence of our vetting and then shorten your own time frame or risk allocation to these projects, I think there's some partnerships to be potentially there.
So the partnership, Chinua, how would you seek to take that forward?
Thank you. So it's something we're very keen on exploring, and I think to the earlier point I made about what type of structure, vehicle, partnership, or model we could evolve to. I think looking at like an infraco Africa model, which covers Africa, but the view is you increasingly need in-country replications of these facilities to have maximum impact and sustainable impact as well, and more efficiency. So we would be exploring how best these models could be domesticated and now rely for technical assistance and capacity to the out-country entities. So, but firstly, I think we're already having these conversations already with all of at least with USAID and with Infraco Africa, who's also, we have a broader relationship from the Pitch group, and also some of the developers here. It's really how to coordinate and have a structural approach to maximizing these opportunities. There is appetite. If you speak to local governments, or if you speak to the governments, even the state governments, there is clearly a budget deficit that is growing. Lagos State, for example, only finances its capex about 30%, and its population growth is about 3% per annum. So there's clearly a deficit that needs to be financed, and it cannot be financed by the government going forward from their balance sheet. So there is fiscal constraints that would force that discipline, that would require that they have to sit on the table with private sector to formulate the best model that would ease the constraints on their balance sheet, create jobs and sustainability for their markets. And we're increasingly having those sort of conversations. And I think even within Lagos, as an example, there is a drive to initiate what you call the embedded power program. They want to crowd in private capital to fund about an expansion plan of 3,000 megawatt in Lagos. There's a clear policy statement in that regard. The regulation has been put in place. Now it's attracting that capital, and they are willing to work with the private sector to develop a framework that would make this sustainable. So we're seeing a willingness, and I think what particularly we've experienced over the past year and we see as a strong benefit is the use of capital markets, whether directly or indirectly. What capital markets brings is it brings market discipline, it brings transparency and sustainability. And so being able to develop or have a coordinated approach means that if you have secondary investors setting out what they want to see, and they're clearly the same conditionalities that you would like to see for predictability and certainty, and you have the early stage developers and other counterparties setting out the terms, you probably would see more incentive from the government side because they can see a clear linkage across the value chain. That's our thinking, and certainly looking to exploring this. So I do hope that at the next summit, we should have a case study to talk about, or some progress to talk about, because for us it's actually critical that we unlock early stage financing in a manner that creates more bankable operating assets. Otherwise we will keep having this conversation over and over again.
Emmanuel, are you going to support Chinua here by hopefully preventing this conversation from being a recurring one and be part of that pilot program?
Yeah, with pleasure. But on my side, I would like to leverage on what was just said. I think that if we want Africa to develop itself, there is clear need for developers and for local developers to be on the deals. There is clear need for local banks to be on the deals, for local institutions to be on the deals. And we will be trying more and more to support that, because it is a must, and yeah, it is is for when you are saying what could we do more better, I believe that this is an answer.
Fantastic. So we can open the floor now for 3 questions, I think. Okay, that's 1. Is everyone hungry, or is it just we've covered everything?
I mean, thanks to the panel. Just a very quick one. I mean, the title of this panel is Development Innovations, and if we look at the backdrop of it, the deficit we face is huge. I mean, you made the example of Lagos. I mean, one thing I often told the governor of Lagos is Lagos's budget is 1 trillion naira, which is probably about the biggest. I mean, Lagos would be about the 6th largest economy in Africa if you were a country of its own. But as a percentage of GDP, that spend is only 2% of the GDP of Lagos. So the money is minuscule in terms of making any impact. So there's this huge financing out there. We've got project development. So my question to the panel is, how can we accelerate projects to market? How can we learn from, you spend 5 years doing a project in Chad. You come across the border in Nigeria, spend another 5 years developing a fairly very similar project. While I do recognize that countries are different, how can we introduce an assembly line approach? Where you develop a set of standards and you can, basically pull things together. And, it may not be 100% of it, but 80% of it to accelerate project. Because what I'm afraid of is that, look, we're heading towards a social crisis. In terms of, what is needed to solve this problem. I always tell our president, he says, if we don't kill corruption, corruption will kill us. But for me in Africa, if we don't kill our infrastructure deficit, the deficit will kill us. Or in fact, it's killing us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chidi. Any other questions before I pass it over to the panel? Okay, I think then. No? Okay, so then perhaps we'll start with you, Emmanuel. We'll come down and perhaps you might incorporate your closing comments.
Yeah, I think that standardization is part of the answer, and what all the lenders have been involved in in having Azure Power as a benchmark in Nigeria has really been a tough involvement in order for this type of project then to be leveraged, and then for the next IPPs to be leveraged on the same basis. Unfortunately, the government has not supported the idea, and despite all the investment that has been done on these projects, we all know where the solar.
Chinua?
Well, I do agree that there certainly needs to be a different approach, and I agree that being able to learn from global experiences or from case studies is why we even exist as an entity today, because of the collaboration between the Nigerian Sovereign Wealth Fund and Garanco, which Garanco has been providing guarantees for over a decade and replicated the model locally. And so we're the first domestic credit enhancement facility for infrastructure. So again, it's really to that logic of saying that if this can happen, then how do you, the logical extension of a credit enhancement facility, how do you logically extend that to a project, early stage project development facility, and how could that work in a way that there's a symbiotic relationship between that and the secondary market, bringing in the governance best practices and technical expertise. So conceptually, I do agree that we need to do that so that we don't have to say the same thing over and over again. I think in terms of execution, I guess from the panel discussion, there's clearly an appetite to explore this, whether you call it an innovation or more coordination. Execution-wise, I imagine we're more than willing to work with counterparties that are interested in, because for us it's bringing sustainability to the infrastructure value chain, and certainly willing to work with counterparties to ensure that there is coordination, appropriate risk allocation, and aligned incentive across the value chain.
Okay, thank you. Bertrand?
Yeah, thanks for the good question. Well, not much to add, to be honest, other than DFIs or DFIs alike. If you think of InfraCo, which is not really DFI, but DFIs or DFIs alike have a massive problem and cannot concentrate all their money into Lagos. We have to do more. I felt you were asking for that. Having said that, the little bit of innovation we're going to try to do in Lagos is actually on marine transport, as opposed to power, because also our view of Lagos/Nigeria is that the private sector is a well-running machine in that space, which is not the case in other countries. So instead of going power in Nigeria/Lagos, we're going to go marine transport. We are not just power, even though our portfolio is majority power. Our remit is water, potable water, transport, and power. A last thing I'm going to say, and it's not targeted to Lagos or Nigeria. One thing that will put an Infraco off, or a pitch off, or a DFI off, and they'll run away from it is corruption. So, and all that led me to think is, if Lagos is the third country by GDP, according to what you said, why isn't Lagos helping Lagos? There's money there. If it's the sixth country by GDP, there's an inherent issue if Lagos is not helping Lagos. And if there's an inherent issue, it's not a country or a couple of countries which are thousands of miles away from it that are going to be able to solve that inherent problem in Lagos. So, food for thought before actual food. Thanks.
Well, there's actual food out there, but I think we have an inherent issue. I think we have an inherent issue here, which is ultimately, what role, what level of innovation, what degree of leadership can development partners and DFIs play to at least accelerate the attainment of financial close. So I think I'd like Lida to just bookend us with her views on that before we close the session.
Well, I think that Nigeria is a great sort of case study in ways that things that can be done, and we actually are pretty excited about Lagos as a market structure, as a setup of clearly defined rules. Emmanuel talked a little bit about some of the frustration of the solar projects in the north. Where there is an ability to set out clear guidelines and investors responded quickly to that, it does really shorten the timeline. It'd be great to see that those projects actually get to the finish line before rules are changed. So I think that you're already seeing in Nigeria, investors respond to some of the early stages of power sector reform bill and the flare gas capture in light of Lagos. Those models and looking at models elsewhere, like the REAP in South Africa, I think that some of our role is helping to share with governments what the real dividends and deferred dividends are of having clear models, sticking to them, and then letting the private sector, just sitting back and letting the private sector respond to them and bring the money that they will do, and shown time and time again, when there is a clear pathway and ability to get to the finish line.
Well, thank you very much. And with that said, and in the interest of time, please join me in thanking my panel for their inputs.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.